I think we open the floor because there are a lot of very smart people, and I start with Paul. Is there a microphone? Is there any immediate reaction on the podium to each one or another? No. Okay. Just to use the time.
I guess I'm older than John Kay because this idea of this question that's raised today, nobody responded. There was the same inquiry back in the 1930s. It was called the Pecora hearings. And the result of that was a new regulation of financial markets called the Glass-Steagall Act, which, in essence, if Dirk, 5,000 years ago, the lenders operated under a Glass-Steagall Act, even though they didn't know it, because there was no secondary markets for those clay tablets. Once you had the clay tablet, you were stuck with it until the tablet was paid off by the original owners. Now, it seems to me, and this was implied in John Kay's question, we have to separate financial markets into what I would call illiquid asset, which was what the Glass-Steagall Act attempted to do. With loans to the real sector were illegal assets, illiquid assets that could not be resold, and therefore the lender had skin in the game for the entire amount and was very careful about what he was doing and knew what the value, or he thought he knew what the value of these things were, as opposed to liquid assets where, as Peter Bernstein in his Against the Gods talked about, where the markets were that you could make a fast exit at any time. And this is where traders make their money from. I would add to John's point that asset values in these liquid assets are, according to P.T. Barnum, where those profits come from is that there's a sucker born every minute, and you can pass these liquid assets off to places like California pension funds and things of that sort. So wouldn't the important thing be here to get back to a sort of Glass-Steagall thing, separate financial markets that provide real loans to the real sector and make them illegal, make it impossible to resell them in the old Black Queen game, and have liquid assets, which are just gambling tools for people who want to gamble.
Thank you. I'm going to collect three because there are a lot of questions. You behind the woman in, yeah.
To comment on Dirk's presentation, I'm really struck in all the conversation, all the talk we have about credit, that we seldom talk about the price of credit, the rate of interest, and the impact that has on GDP growth, on the rate of profit, on the need to increase returns in order to pay off debts. And it has particular relevance to our morning session and to Peter Victor's contribution this morning, in which we're trying to manage growth. But as long as we don't manage the price of credit and also, of course, ration the availability of credit, we're not going to be able to manage those other processes. And I was very struck in Peter's contribution that he put the finance sector at the top, the real economy, as he called it, or the economy, and then the ecosystem at the bottom. I think it should be the other way around. We should put the finance sector at the bottom, and if we restrain, regulate, and manage that, and in particular the price of credit, then we may be able to manage those other sectors. So I just want to ask why we don't talk enough about the rate of interest and the impact of that on what it's doing to the ecosystem, because in order to get rates of return to pay off debts, you have to extract even more assets from A, the ecosystem, and B, labor. And it's that exploitation which is at the heart of the crisis we face now.
Okay, on your right, please.
I'm going to be a little bit provocative. I want to ask you about hypocrisy. The question for this panel was, how do you make a credit system socially responsible? I think a more important way of asking this question is, how do you make financial executives socially responsible? In a sense, the Glass-Steagall Act was a compromise with the financial sector. In the midst of the Pecora Commission, there was increasing evidence of, frankly, enormously aggressive behavior. And the financial sector agreed, well, we'll split the companies, and that way we personally can go about whatever we do. And I'm wondering, maybe this is the wrong panel to ask this question, because it's a behavioral question, perhaps, behavioral economics or something like that. But how is it that a financial sector worldwide preaches continuously and aggressively about personal responsibility, but yet itself likes to take those bonuses in the year they're earned in amounts which, frankly, take care of themselves and their families for generations? Why is it that they are not asked to take responsibility for making sure those bonuses remain, so to speak, earned year after year in the future? Why is it that this panel does not speak in terms of, so to speak, personal responsibility of those executives? And in essence, in all of this discussion, it's almost as if to say, these executives did not know that there's a martingale game, a St. Petersburg game, that there's embezzlement and the rest. The reality is, they understand this very well. These products are structured this way. As John pointed out, they are composites of these ideas. So why is it that we don't speak in terms of making financial executives socially responsible?
Okay, thank you. I would say if they couldn't make the money, the question wouldn't be there. But I would make a first round on the podium and then next round of questions, please.
Okay. Can you hear me? So to the last question, I'm very skeptical about behavioral economics being a solution to financial sector troubles. In the first place, individuals often don't know, simply don't know, even if they are well-intentioned, which you doubt, but even if they are, they don't know the exact difference between what's individually optimal and what's socially optimal. For a mortgage banker, it's individually optimal probably to give out more mortgage loans. That's the business he or she is in. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not bashing bankers. But it may be socially far below optimal if this particular banker goes on. He simply has no way to know, perhaps. That is one thing. Second, why is it that particularly in the financial industry, we see such limitless greed, is the question that you ask. Now again, that's not, I don't think psychology is going to help us a whole lot there. I mean, you will find lots of interesting findings, but you also have to look at the nature of money. Money is not like a commodity. Commodities need inputs. Money doesn't need an input. So from the supply side, there is no constraint whatsoever. You can produce it in limitless quantities, technically speaking. At the demand side, you know, when I've had my 5 potatoes, I don't want a 6th, but the demand for money is equally limitless. So you have limitless demand and supply, principally only constrained by regulation. There's nothing else that constrains money creation than regulation, in principle. So for people operating in such a system, if you deregulate it, automatically you get limitless behavior. That's my answer.
Okay. Please keep short because there are a lot of questions. Please, Katharina.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly respond to that question as well and come back to the liquidity of assets. Regarding individual responsibility, I think it's fair to say that the bankers got off very lightly this time. In most other crises, some people would go to jail, and maybe that sort of gives us some closure in terms of justice. Of course, it has never prevented the emergence of yet another bubble or financial crisis. So I think there is a structural issue that we have to address. But I'm with you in terms of setting some incentives straight. It might be helpful to think about how we let them off the hook. On the liquidity of assets, I can see sort of the temptation of saying, let's separate this again. And actually, I've talked to some people also in the financial industry who would find this a clearer solution than, let's say, the Volcker rule. It's, of course, very difficult to get the genie back into the bottle once you have it let out, right? Sort of after this 30 years of ever more sophisticated financial engineering and actually liquidating assets, that's what it's all about. That's where you make the money, is you basically make some of these assets more liquid and you create another market for them in which you can invest and thereby actually, I think, make your own survival constraint more elastic at the expense of the stability of the system. I think we understand that now. But I'm skeptical that you could just get away from that completely. So I think to some extent we have to see that the markets are as they are. We can take them back a little bit, but we have to find sort of a way to regulate the nodes exactly where the liquidation or the liquidification of assets takes place. That's what we have to regulate, and we haven't found a way yet to do that.
I'm more optimistic about what might be done in that respect. I would link Paul's question about structural separation with Rob's question about personal responsibility. Because to my mind, there will always be talented and greedy people who will take as much money as they can for themselves within the limits of the law. There will also always be professional gamblers who will want to play martingale strategies and the like. What we should definitely do, however, is ensure that these people are very far distant from the retail deposits of ordinary savers and the business of providing credit to mainstream businesses. And that should be the essential part of the agenda of regulatory reform in this sector.
And indeed, in some countries already is. So, as some of you will know, in the UK, under the proposals from the Vickers Commission, there will be not quite a Glass-Steagall, but at least a separate ring fencing of activities that are viewed to be socially useful in some sense, as distinct from those that are legally separated, for whom the social usefulness is more questionable. For me, the real benefit of doing that is the one that John just alluded to. It's not about what happens after problems strike. It's really what benefit this might have on risk management cultures ex ante. It was the commingling of cultures, I think, that led us down a path for which the financial crisis was the inevitable endpoint. And Vickers and Vickers-like proposals do speak to a breaking of that commingling of risk management culture so that not everyone is chasing pennies in front of the oncoming steamroller, which is what martingale strategy effectively is. Another point, just on the third question, I mean, it is as my boss Mervyn King put it a few weeks ago, it tells you something is wrong in an industry when those in it are seeking to earn as much money as possible so they can get out of it as quickly as possible. You know, that's telling you something, that's revealing. For me, the way into that, or one way into that, would be to bring about a more closer alignment between the horizons on which returns are harvested annually and the horizons on which risk materializes, which might be 20 or 30 years. To have truly performance, which means risk-adjusted pay, there needs to be a much closer alignment between those two horizons. And in doing that, actually, you come close to replicating an unlimited liability partnership-type model, which speaks to the first question about the commingling of cultures.
Okay, Gonna collect 3 or 4. And please, 30 seconds, no more.
Yeah, my name's Josh Ryan Collins from the New Economics Foundation in London. I think Dirk's talk really got to the heart of this problem. The way to create a socially useful financial system is to create incentives for banks or whoever creates credit to put it into the productive sector, not into the speculative sector. I've seen very little evidence in reforms and regulations that have been suggested so far that take a more proactive approach rather than simply reducing this kind of speculative investment, which raising capital reserves might well do. The examples empirically of states which are successful at getting credit into the productive sector actually seem to have had nationalised banks or a very different banking structure to the ones we have in the UK and much of Europe and the US. If you look at Germany, for example, We have a much bigger range of smaller banks, which actually are capable of developing relationships with small businesses. If you looked at credit to small businesses during the crisis, it was maintained in contrast to most of the rest of the Western world. I think what we need to think about, and I'd like to hear the panelists' view on this, is much more radical structural reforms, whether it's nationalisation of banks, whether it's breaking up banks to change their incentives so the way they make profit is not purely through speculative asset-backed investment, whether it's removing limited liability. I want to see some discussion of these more proactive options.
Okay, Sonny, 30 seconds.
Unfortunately, most of the ongoing regulatory reforms are trying to answer the question, which is we had this crisis, how to prevent another one happening. Now, there's an implicit assumption there that most of the costs of having a financial system that is not functioning properly actually arise during crisis time. That's completely false assumption. What we have seen and what was clearly demonstrated, I think, in some of the graphs, is that the financial system we had before it became fashionable was the kind that actually supported much higher levels of growth. So the question we are trying to address, Redefine's done a report for the European authorities, which is not public, which answers the question how to regulate a financial system for the real economy. And the question we are trying to address is how to make sure that the peacetime cumulative costs, which may never actually result in a crash, if you simply go down from growth potential levels of 4% to potential growth levels of 2%, it's not necessary that it's going to end up in a crash. So yet it has significant opportunity costs. And in order to do that, we've looked at several principles. And in that, it's legitimate to target the size of the financial system. Price discovery was not mentioned much. It was mostly about credit. But the fundamental system you have of price discovery, which is supposed to allocate resources to where it goes, and John mentioned it a bit, and Andy mentioned it a bit. Stock markets, the old-fashioned way. 90% of trading is done by people who either don't know what company they're trading or don't care. Between index traders, passive index traders, and high-frequency traders, neither of whom know what they're buying and selling. That's where price discovery happens. Let me quickly run you through three. So, tackling short-termism, right-sizing finance, and making sure that there's massive diversity in the financial system, because we are regulating towards a loss in diversity with standardization, which will only make sure we're going to end up with another crash. I can send you later details. I will publish excerpts of it, but I think it's going to be a useful report in terms of taking the somewhat abstract discussion into what needs to be done now.
Okay. The lady.
I think that we have to remember in the structural reforms that Lehman Brothers was an investment bank. So there's only so much of that we can contain unless maybe, and nobody commented on that, we do something about derivatives. There was a little bit mentioned by Katerina there, but that genie seems to be a big one that I was wondering what people think about.
Thank you. And I'll take a last question for this round by Axel.
Yes. On personal responsibility and how to induce it, I'd just like to mention what I took up very briefly yesterday. One way to get personal responsibility is to create personal liability. And so I would like some people to take this matter seriously. If you remunerate bank executives with shares that are not marketable for a stretch of years, so to lengthen the time perspective, and these shares carry double liability or higher, I think you will see far more responsible behavior. One other point. Some years ago, I described the leverage competition in that industry. And I live quite close to the greatest concentration of elephant seals in the world. And Andy, I am so regretful that I failed to make the connection.
Thank you. Some brief answers?
Yeah. So far I didn't answer Anne Pettifor's question about interest rates, and also your question about, so what sort of structural reforms do we need? Basically, you can forbid, that's one way to go, which is very difficult with the sort of complex system that we have now in shadow banking, or you can not insure, and that's, I think, is part of the answer. So casino-like activities, to put it harshly, well, you know, they will always go on and you can't really outlaw them, but at least you cannot insure them. And you can also not support, let me put it that way. That's different from insuring certain activities. What you now do is we support banks lock, stock and barrel. But we really need to start thinking about which parts of banks do we want to support actively. I think those are the most pressing issues now. And then we can go on to issues, well, credit is a public good, so shouldn't it be at least partly publicly created? That's an important issue, but I think that's a longer term issue.
Good.
Maybe one more comment here. I think we shouldn't assume that these are clearly different entities. I think we come from a history of highly fragmented markets in which some of the entities were more protected and actually they could do the real lending and have done so. But nowadays they're highly competitive with one another and clearly much interconnected. Also, a point on the Vickers committee's report, you know, I see that they are trying to attempt to have a real structural divide, but how many years do we have to wait for that to come into effect? And what are the institutions doing in the meantime? Why do we need this transition period? Precisely because they're trying to prepare themselves, and they will undoubtedly find other ways to circumvent and arbitrage around that. So I think we have to anticipate that. I'm not saying we can't do any structural reforms, but we really have to either probably go much, much further in doing that and really segment these markets. Just to remind you, the government-sponsored entities in the US were government-sponsored entities. Once they went into the competitive markets and emulated everybody else, they produced exactly the results that everybody else was producing. So I don't think that public ownership necessarily is enough. There's got to be more than that. We really then have to separate, and they can't do certain things. And these other banks also can't get on their turf. We have to go all the way back to that, and I'm just a little doubtful that we can.
I think public ownership of financial institutions is a pretty bad idea overall, though it may be a rather good idea in a transitional period as a means of implementing structural reform relatively quickly. And I think we've missed a trick in a serious way in the United Kingdom by failing to use our effective public ownership of two major financial institutions to bring about a restructuring of the UK retail financial sector.
Not all credit is created equally. I mean, we'll agree with that. But I mean, I'm mindful to try and avoid what my friend Axel Hufford might call the kind of Gosplan approach to credit allocation. I think there's some risk of overstepping the mark on what we know about this. At the same time, there is more that regulation could do to recognize some of the externalities, good and bad, from different credit types. Intra-financial system credit comes with a fairly clear interconnectivity stroke complexity externality. Lending to small businesses, prospectively at least, comes with a positive GDP externality. Casting the debate in that way strikes me as useful. Picking winners along the credit allocation spectrum strikes me, at least for me, as a step far too far. Just on diversity, all of us in this room would sit down and agree 100% that we would wish that we had a more diverse financial system, that we would wish that both entry to and exit from banking and finance was at higher levels than is the case right now. Unfortunately, I've heard over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, not one good suggestion of how that increased entry rate might be brought about. We are willing the ends without the faintest notion of the means. But not to end negatively, here's a suggestion for making it happen. Have financial firms adhere to common standards, a common language for how they describe their products. and then have that information made available to all. I think that as a method has worked well in industries outside of finance, and I think within finance it's the only good way I can think of breaking down barriers to entry and bringing about the diversity that I think we all view as important.
Thank you. So let's take a last round, I think. The second time. The organizers have taken Katarina's proposal for granted, that no predetermined standard rules. So we have a little more time till 1 o'clock and 10 minutes. So 10 minutes left.
I think like many sessions in this conference, we treat the problems as a problem in economic engineering. But one of the consequences of this process over the last 3 decades has been a big transfer of resources into the financial sector. And this resource translates into power, into political power. And that power, I think, is a formidable obstacle to doing anything. If we ask why Vickers has to take such a long time to be implemented, if we ask why we regard housing loans or real estate as part of the retail activities of banks, you might look into the composition of that committee and the privileged place that finance has on that committee and the other forms of veto power which that sector has accumulated over these decades.
So, yeah, and then we go.
Yeah, I want to second what was just said. And one manifestation of this is the extensive bank lobbying that's been going on in the US and here in Europe as well over these financial reforms. One of the arguments that the bank lobbyists have been making against almost any kind of financial reform, the Volcker Rule and so forth, is that it will reduce the supply of liquidity. And there's this argument that liquidity is socially useful. This has been signed on to by some governments, Canadian governments, some European governments, against the Volcker Rule, for example, saying that applying this to buying of sovereign debt will hurt the ability for governments to sell sovereigns. So I'm wondering if the panel members can explain what is the validity and what is wrong with this argument about the importance of liquidity.
Thank you, lady. Thank you.
This on? Oh, there we go. Okay. This is going back to the question about the personal responsibility. And I'm not at all saying there doesn't need to be restructuring and regulations and the rest. But I also wonder to what extent it might be living down to very low expectations, part of which economists as a group might be somewhat guilty of. That is, our model of Homo economicus is someone who doesn't really care about other people, who is purely profit-oriented, et cetera. And we read that into, it seems like the closer something is to money and finance, the more we believe that's true. Two things about that. One, the recent essay in the New York Times by the person who left Goldman because they felt it was no longer providing customer services. Some people in industries are actually still concerned about what they produce, not just how much money they make. That ideology of profit and money making, of course, is also filtering into nonprofit and education centers. It's certainly coming down in my university, a lot of this. We just have to watch the bottom line thing. So I'm wondering how much we create in Homo economicus a bad model of motivations, a bad model of social connection, and then read that into the things that we're studying.
Okay, we can take 3 left, and that's Jasper. Yeah.
Thanks. Jasper Sky, affiliate of the 4CMR unit at University of Cambridge. I wanted to know whether, to address the question of how to design a socially useful banking system, we might not work from the bottom up and ask, do we need a private banking system at all? Maybe what we need is private equity funds that manage private wealth using real money, equity money, for speculative purposes. And for the purposes of extending credit, we need simply to do what Germany already does. The local Sparkassen system, which is regional public banks, publicly owned by municipalities and regions, which are only allowed to extend credit within their region. Landesbanken, better regulated than in the past, which would only be charged with loaning to industry within a given state or region, and then national and international development banks. Because if you're giving somebody the power to create money, which is what credit extension is, you really want to make sure that these people, if you want to have a socially useful system, are motivated by the social concerns, which isn't to say that there's no role for private money, but that should be mutual funds, it should be equity funds. It shouldn't, I don't see why we allow leverage speculation on asset prices. If we're going to allow leverage, it should be only for the purposes of creating new real wealth. And the best way to do it to make sure it's socially useful is to actually put these rights in the hands of a multi-tiered system of public banks which are restricted geographically and in mandate. That would be my hypothesis. And I'd like to know whether Mr. Bessemer and others on the panel would say yay or nay to that idea.
Okay, can take, yes, you. Last question, sorry, but...
This will be very brief. It's now a commonplace that a Tobin tax on financial transactions is both highly desirable but totally unworkable. Is there any dissent from either of those propositions?
Thank you very much. So I give last word to the podium to the speakers. Katharina, would you start?
I just want to briefly respond to Andre's suggestion about lowering entry barriers. I can see that, but you know, since I'm not an economist, maybe I can also suggest that competition actually more often than not results in standardization, not diversity. So we've seen this in the US. We broke down the barriers at the state level for banking. What have we seen? An enormous consolidation, enormous streamlining of bank operations. So I don't really believe that competition per se will bring about the results. I'm more sympathetic in sort of a clear fragmentation of markets where we actually protect some, maybe through ownership structures, maybe through other ways, and maybe the Sparkassen model in Germany could serve as another one. Because I think we have really seen that whenever other institutions are given the opportunity to make profits by speculating in more liquid assets, that's what they will do. I mean, when they created the securitized mortgages in the United States in the 70s, they thought that small little banks, that the mutual funds would go into that, the pension funds would go into that. In fact, local banks went into that because these were risk-free assets and thereby crowded out small, medium-sized enterprises from lending markets. So whenever these markets can really interact with one another, I think you see a drift towards where you can make a lot of money with very little effort. And if you want to protect this other much more complicated real lending system, we have to find structures for doing that.
Thank you. Tom?
There are a great many points, and I will just pick up a couple. You know, one is to say that a large part of the problem we have in the financial sector is encapsulated in the more is less observation, or less is more. Liquidity is a good thing, but it does not follow from that the more liquidity there is, the better markets work. So many derivatives have some uses. That doesn't mean that there is a use to derivative trading on the scale in which it currently exists. And one can repeat that observation across instrument after instrument across the financial sector. And the largest and most difficult problem we have is how, without eliminating these instruments and these innovations, we trim back the activity in the sector to a level that actually serves socially useful purposes. And the point that Avnar and one or two others have made about the political power of the financial services industry is very relevant to that particular issue. Because we are today in the situation where this is the most powerful industry lobby which there is, perhaps the most powerful lobby which there is of any kind in the United States and in Europe. And that creates what is in effect the kind of self-reinforcing cycle that people like Simon Johnson have described, in which political power is used to leverage economic power and vice versa. And until we break that, I think it will be very difficult for us to get the financial system we need.
1 minute each.
Well, maybe just on John's second point. I mean, obviously the lobby is important, but it's not going away. And the issue for us, if we're not just to sit here and wring our hands about it, is what can be done. And on that, I'm mildly encouraged by what has happened over the last 3 or 4 years. I think in 1 or 2 places, analysis, research, the truth, has made a difference to real outcomes on the regulatory front. And if there is one silver lining from the dark cloud of the crisis, it is that, if nothing else, it has caused a much broader range of researchers to take an interest in the real issues on the table, and hopefully to put that analysis in play, and hopefully with time, that will have an impact on the decision makers. So I'd like to be encouraging that the bad ideas of the lobby can in time be beaten back, provided we don't wring our hands, we get on and produce the ammunition that policymakers then can put to use. And on liquidity, I mean, again, similarly to John, it has taken on some totemic value, which is out of proportion to its importance, I think. You see that no more, or no better, than in, say, the market for trading of equity, where very much more time and energy is put into the technology for trading these instruments than is put into the technology for raising debt or equity in the first place. That's a diagnostic on us perhaps having overbalanced in how much of a good thing liquidity really is.
Thank you. Last word.
Credit is what credit does. You can't speak of liquidity as a thing. Liquidity is a relation. You have so much extra liquidity, credits, assets, which means that there's so much extra liabilities somewhere held by someone in the economy. That's a net burden. So, you know, and this links to Avner's question about political power. There's also something like the power of ideas. I haven't heard a single question about how we shrink the debt. And that's because we don't think in terms of credit and debt still. We don't do that. So as long as we think that banks are in fact sacred, that they are the pillars of the economy, they must be protected lock, stock and barrel, as long as we don't see that we need to shrink the debt, I think we are missing, well, to use that phrase again, we are missing elephants in the room.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we had a lot of interesting ideas. I'm not sure if we have the real final answer, but we had a real question raise, to put it for Andrew, and I tried to regulate a little bit, but don't know if I succeeded in. I think for sure, my impression is that the questions and the answers and your diagnosis gets more radical every year. I mean, the general mood gets more radical. I mean, we wouldn't have talked about that in Cambridge, I think, in that manner, and talking about public banks and so on. But it helps, perhaps, to find the right answer, and we perhaps get nearer to that next year, or in between. So, thank you very much, and have a nice lunch time.